at some point in the inquiry, I discovered that Colchester Castle is actually symbolises the Grail Castle in my own life story. I came to Colchester in 1997 with a friend who's now professor of psychoanalysis in Freudian and Jungian studies at the University of Essex, which is just a few miles outside of Colchester. And in about 1998, I had a UFO experience here, and standing at the window in the evening and looking at Orion, I had earlier drawn a pentagram on the pavement outside, having seen the pentagram in Israel Regardie's Encyclopedia of the Golden Dawn, and he was a friend of Aleister Crowley's, and I saw these 5 lights above me. They're orange gold discs in a pentagram formation, and I've spoken about this on Basis 73 Part 3 recently. Well, what I didn't say on that program was that the day before I had noticed a black cat, a kitten, down the road. And when I was having the experience with the pentagram and the UFOs, the black cat was right there near the pentagram. This was in the evening, it was dark. And I hadn't really, just seen the kitten once before. So the following day after that experience of the UFO, which actually disappeared near the military base. So I'm going out down to the river on my daily walk, down Rosebery Avenue, and there's the cat. And it's close by, and it comes over and I pet it. And I thought to myself, I'll look at the tag on the collar, because they usually wear tags on the collar. And I looked at the tag, and it was a silver tag, and all it had on there was the name Osiris. Which, the idea that there's a black cat called Osiris, it's like highly unlikely. And of course, Orion is the star system of Osiris. Anyway, my walk was from the East Hill, where there's a huge flour mill, very, very old flour mill, been renovated into flats. It's a huge place, very beautiful structure. And it's where the estuary comes up from the North Sea, or the German Sea, and it comes up about 6 miles, and then there's a kind of weir, and then it meets the fresh water. So the salt water meets the fresh water, and then it was siphoned off into the flour mill, the fresh water, and used in the flour mill. And then I go up the river, and that goes into the park, Castle Park, and there's Upper and Lower Castle Park, and the castle's on top of the hill. It's a Celtic hill, and this was the Celtic centre of England. This is where the chief king lived. And so you go into the park, you go through the park at the bottom by the river, and then you go further up the river and you come to Northbridge. And then I used to come down the other side, so maybe 5 miles plus. And I still make that basic walk today. It takes about 1 hour and 45 minutes. I go very slowly, I look at everything, and so forth. So this was probably 1999. I'm coming up from the weir, coming up the freshwater side, and I stop. It's the middle of the summer, late summer. I'm looking at the dragonflies, various dragonflies going up and down. And this black dog comes over, very, very hairy looking black dog, quite big. And then a voice says, "Oh, don't worry about the dog, it's all right." And it's an old man, very old man, probably around 89 years of age. He said, what are you doing? I said, "Oh, I'm just looking at the dragonflies." And we have a little chat, and he goes off. And the next day I meet him further up the river, and there's a lake, there's an ornamental lake, and it's got an island with lots of trees on, and it's surrounded by alternate willow trees and Lombardy poplar, very tall poplar trees. And just to mention a mythic connection is that Demeter, who's Ceres, in the daughter of Gaia, she's the Earth Mother, and her daughter is Persephone, and Persephone was abducted by Hades, who's Zeus's brother, and she goes down into the underworld, becomes the queen of death. And Zeus isn't happy about that, and Demeter is going around the earth searching for her daughter, and she makes the whole earth infertile. So, in a sense, it's like the Grail legend, it's like a wasteland. And Zeus sends Hermes, the mediator, Mercury, Hermes, down to Hades to act as a diplomat, to mediate between Zeus and Hades. And Hades is told that Persephone must be allowed to leave. And as she's leaving, Hades gives her the 7 seeds of the pomegranate. And what happens actually because of that is that she remains under the ground during the winter time and is allowed up in the spring and through the summer for 6 months. And as she rises out of the earth, she's called the Maiden of the Spring, and she's carrying the cornucopia, which is filled with all the seeds that will then germinate and flourish in the summer. Well, as the Queen of Death, she actually lives in the Atlantic Ocean near Britain, as do the Muses, and also the Gorgons. And the most beautiful of the 3 Gorgons is Medusa. So she lives on an island, as it were, could be near Atlantis, etc. But she lives on an island to the north of the Pillars of Hercules, just to the north of the east coast of Spain, and she lives in a grove of willow and poplar. So I'm just saying this particular lake is, I used to think of it as the grove of Persephone. And another deity that lives in that area of Britain is Styx, and the nymph Styx is actually the river Styx, which is the infernal black river that you have to cross with the ferryman Charon, and from, for example, in Hades, the shades, the dead souls, as it were, are ferried over, and you have to be a dead soul to be ferried over the river Styx. and it's in the river Styx that Achilles is actually held by the foot, and he's dipped into the river Styx, and that makes you immortal. But because someone was holding on to the heel of Achilles, then that was his vulnerable spot. So we have the idea of the Achilles heel. So you could say it's the vulnerable spot. You might say it's a spot of imperfection, the mortal body, and he was actually killed in the Trojan War by I think it was Prince Paris, who abducted Helen, the Spartan Helen, so she became Helen of Troy, and Achilles was killed in that battle. And I think, I'm not sure, I think he was shot in the heel. I'm not sure if he was actually shot but with an arrow. Anyway, so I'm coming up towards the lake where the Queen of Death is, as it were, and Persephone, and I see the old man again. He's there with his dog, and I noticed that it's probably around October. It's probably October 1999, I think. And I see two birds in the middle of the lake, and I assume they're winter visitors, that come to England or come from Scotland or something, come south where it's a bit warmer. And I said to him, do you know the name of these two birds? He says, no, I don't know the name of them, but this man might know the name of them. And coming towards us was this short man. The old man is very short, and then another old man comes who's a bit younger. He's 82 actually, and he comes towards us, and he's wearing a black cap, and I'm not sure what you call the star. I know Donovan and some of the people in the 60s used to wear these peak caps. I'm not sure. It's a bit like somebody that drives a train, with a peak cap. But he's wearing a peak cap, and he's wearing this black coat, and he's with a black poodle. So he's walking this very small black poodle, and her name turns out to be Tosca, based on the opera Tosca. I'm trying to think of the name of the composer. I'm not sure. Anyway, he says, oh, they're a pair of goosanders. And the goosander, the female is grey, and it's got a ginger crest on its head. It's a beautiful bird. And the male is white with a green head, a very emerald green head, a beautiful pair of birds. So anyway, that takes place, and I don't know how many days later, I'm by the lake again. There's nobody around. There's very few people walk around that area. And there's the second old man, and I'll call him the old man. He's the second old man. And he starts to tell me that he writes poetry, and he makes up these little stories. And he begins to tell me this story, because he knows I'm interested in mythology and such. And he says that he's sleeping in bed, and he has a dream, and he's flying in a plane, and he goes to the moon, and he goes past the moon, and he's going into outer space to maybe the other planets, and a goddess appears in the sky, and her name's Iris, and she's goddess of the rainbow in Greek mythology. And she says, you can't come any further, you have to go back. And he says, well, can I use your rainbow as a slide? If I can slide back into bed. So he did. He slid down the rainbow and came into his bed. And I found him very amusing. When I first saw him, I noticed very dark energy in his eyes, and he seemed very emotive, and I was slightly suspicious of him. I don't know, I just had this slightly, like a kind of almost like shadowy figure, you know. And so I leave him, I go home, and I thought, I didn't know much about mythology, I was just beginning, I didn't know much about Greek mythology, so I have Serlo's Dictionary of Symbols, which is the kind of quintessential book on symbols, Serlo, and it's more of a Jungian based book, and I think it's published by Routledge in London, and probably in the 60s, and I'm looking up Iris. I thought, well, I'll find out who Iris is. So I'm looking up Iris, I'm reading about Iris, and the radio's on, Radio 3, playing some classical music. And then the news comes on, and it says the Oxford philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch has just recently died today. And I thought, wow, you know, that's amazing, you know, massive synchronicity between the goddess Iris and Iris Murdoch. Well, it happened that when I lived in Oxford, from about 89 to 90, I lived in the Institute of Psychophysical Research for a year, and that's run by Celia Green, and she coined the term lucid dream. She wrote books on out of the body, apparitions, etc. I lived there for a year and studied that subject. I studied all about Robert Monroe and astral travelling and really got into all of that. And that was on the Banbury Road in North Oxford. And just around the corner lived Iris Murdoch, and I used to see her in Summertown just up the road. I'd seen her around, I was quite close up to her and everything. And also I got to know Krishnamurti, the Indian guru, in the 70s and 80s and such. And she interviewed Krishnamurti, and also she wrote a book on the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, and I consider myself philosophically an existentialist. So I was really impressed with Iris Murdoch, and so that was a massive synchronicity. And then I got to know the old man. I got to know him, that he had many apparitions in his house, and his children had seen apparitions, and his family, etc. But he never told anybody. He never read books. He wasn't religious. He was very magical, but he'd not read any books on magic or anything like that. He was just an ordinary man. He worked in a grocery shop. He was a manager. And everybody knew him in Colchester. He appeared in the paper for a couple of things. He wrote a poem and put it in the paper. He used to do reviews for like the various grocery shops. So, you know, he was very well known in Colchester. So when later on, I got very close to him. I used to visit him every day in his house. And we used to walk up and down the river, and he taught me all the wildflowers. His wife had died, and he more or less was on his own, and he taught me all the wildflowers up and down the river. And so I was very, very impressed with him, and we used to look for four-leaf clovers and find all these four-leaf clovers, and he also showed me a lot of, he's a collector, he collects stamps, he collected postcards, he had a lot of things from the 30s and 40s and 50s in his house. He loved to collect things. And one day he took out these things showing me, and he showed me a slide of a UFO. And I was again shocked, you know, I thought a very ordinary man, etc., etc. And then he brings out this photograph he took. He was on a boat coming out of the river that connects, I think it's the North Sea, above Germany. He's coming from Frankfurt, and he comes into the North Sea, and he's with some people, and he goes on deck in the middle of the night, and it's all black and there's nobody there, and he sees this green light, and he takes a photograph of this green light, and it's a kind of dewdrop green light, and I take it to a local photographer's, and I have it enlarged into a photograph, and it's really a nice image of a UFO. So this man had so many levels, so many connections to so many things. It's really, really uncanny. And one day I was sitting in his sitting room and looking out of the back window, and it's very dark in his house. He lived at the top of the river, and he lived right where North Bridge is. So you have the bridge and you have the river, and he lived right in the corner there. It was a lovely setting, lovely garden. He had a little pond with frogs in and everything. And I was sitting in there and looking out, and he was doing so. He liked to make things in wood and bird houses and things like that. So he had a kind of table there, his kind of workbench. And I was looking out of the window, and I noticed that the buddleia tree, the butterfly tree with large purple plumes, as it were, large purple flowers, long purple flowers. It was moving in the wind. The wind was blowing through the garden, and it took on the form of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent of the Aztecs, and it really did look like the image, the head of the plumed serpent. And then another apparition, as it were, appeared, and it was a tall black dog, a bit like the black shaggy dog of the other man. And of course this man always walked the black poodle, and that's all. It was always in the house when I went there, Tosca. And yes, and so right in front of the head of this plumed serpent, Quetzalcoatl, was this tall black dog sitting on its haunches. Must have been about 6 feet tall, huge black dog. And then I noticed that was in the middle. Then to the left of the garden there was a large chestnut tree, horse chestnut tree, and all up the tree was a serpent. So I saw this serpent all the way up the tree, and the head was at the very top, and the sun was shining through the trees, and it was like flickering light. It was like a flickering light where its head was. And I said to him, you know, I'm seeing some very strange things in your garden. And he wasn't paying attention. He was doing something else and whatever. And he said, oh, yeah. I said, I've just seen a serpent. And he said, oh, yes, it's winking at us, you know. And the light shining through actually did look like, you know, as if the eyes were winking. And I mentioned this on Project Camelot, Kerry Cassidy, and you know, it was just very, very weird. It was just like, how did he see that? I mean, I was seeing it, just a bit of light through the tree, but he interpreted it as the serpent winking, and I found that very, very curious that he would mention that. But there were so many small things that happened with him. Anyway, getting back to, oh yes, another thing. I moved from where I was living before, which was at the bottom of the hill. I moved on to the top of the hill, and I'm only a few hundred feet from the castle, so that fills half of my window. And I've got like 6 windows, as it were, like a huge window with 6 different parts. And so I'd moved in here in the autumn of 2001. And there was an open day in the castle. I'd never been in there before. And there's an open day in the castle. It's a castle museum. It's a museum of Roman Celtic artifacts, basically. And this was the Roman capital, as it were. They established the first town in Britain. This is the first town in Britain, and this was their military centre, and it was conquered by Claudius, Emperor Claudius. And so anyway, it was open night, and I said to him, would you like to go along? And he said, okay, we go along. So we walk into the castle, and in the hallway there were 4 objects. They're on display, like the 4 very important objects. So when you first go in, on the left there was a sarcophagus of an Egyptian princess from, I think it was something like the 9th century BC. And that wasn't really meant to be in there, but it was given to the owners of a mansion that's next door in the grounds. Is a holly tree mansion, and these people were given this sarcophagus. Anyway, that was there, and then there was a female sphinx, a Greek female sphinx, and then there was a funerary bowl, a green funerary bowl. I think it was a Roman funerary bowl. And then the main exhibit was in a glass cabinet, and it was a statue of Mercury. It was a beautiful, absolutely beautiful statue. It's about 18 inches tall, shows him with the wing cap, and it was originally bronze colour, dark colour, and now it's green. It went green, and it's of a youth. It's Hermes, Mercury, as a youth, and he's obviously the messenger of the gods. And what's curious also, that he's a companion of Iris, because Iris, the goddess of the rainbow, is also a messenger of the gods, and they work together. And so Mercury, Hermes, is a very important god in my own mythology. So, getting back to the idea of the castle, as I say, I used to walk around it. I never went into it. I went into it just once with him. And as I did my research, I started my research in about 2002, and I went to all the shops in Colchester. There are 2 main antiquarian bookshops, and lots of charity shops where they have fairly good selection of books in these charity shops, the Oxfam and such. So I went around, and over a few year period, I collected a really good library, a very fairly good mythological occult library, just from books I found around Colchester. And it's a very provincial town. I mean, there's nothing exceptional, there's no alternative scene here, etc. It's a very ordinary backwater town, and yet I found extraordinary books here. And I'd read a book by it's the only real study of the castle, about 1860s, by a medieval scholar called Horace Round. He did a study, and I bought the original book, the first edition, for about £50. It's 1863 or something like that, and it's a description of the castle. It's a medieval castle. It's the biggest castle ever built by the Normans in 1087, the biggest castle in Western Europe. And it's actually the twin of the Tower of London. The Tower of London and this castle here They were built by the same architect, the Bishop of Rochester, and they're the same ground plan and everything, but this is much bigger. But the Tower of London was built on the White Mound, and in the Welsh Mabinogion, which is the kind of, you might say, the quintessential Welsh mythic book, and there's only within the book there's only what they call 4 books or 4 chapters, and it's only about 30 pages, but it's very important. And it says that that the head of Bran, and Bran is the raven, so the black head of Bran, which is also an oracular head, was buried at the White Mound, and which actually acts as a talisman. It's in protection of Britain. And when King Arthur came into being in the 6th century, as it were, at Camelot, he dug up the head and said that only he would be the protector of England. And of course he was the Pendragon, the son of other Pendragon, and Bran was the brother of Beli, and Beli was the head dragon of England. The Pendragon is the head dragon. He was the sun god of Britain. He was like the main god of Britain. And Britain, Hyperborea, was actually identified as Draco, the dragon. And so anyway, I was getting into my own life story, the mythology of the place here, and I read in this book that, it was a book that was talking about the castle, the topography, the history, everything about a classical study of the castle. But one page, he said, on one page, he says that he likens the castle to Camelot. Now, the Celtic name of Colchester, which in the Roman time was the city of victory, because they were victorious here over the Celtic god Canobalin, and it was called Camulodunum, or Camulod. And he took from Camulod the idea of Camelot. And he said that, in a sense, he talked about King Arthur, and he said that King Canobalin was the Pendragon, and he talked about the medieval period where the great-grandson of William the Conqueror, Henry II, who was centred in Oxford, and his wife was Eleanor of Aquitaine, very famous lady, and she was formerly the Queen of France, and she married Henry II in around 1154, and so anyway, this is, he likened Camelot to Camelot, built by the Normans, built by William the Conqueror, and Henry I would be the grandson. This was a royal seat, so this castle, like the Tower of London, that was a royal seat. So the kings would come here, etc. Now, one of the kings was King John, and he was he was the one that was involved in writing the Magna Carta, which is like the main kind of bit like the American document, you know, that kind of document of independence. But anyway, this Magna Carta more or less was a relationship between the king and the people. So it kind of, in a sense, you might say, it protected the people. And so he likened King Arthur to King Canoblin, who was the resident Celtic king, and he was the one that kept the Romans from coming over and conquering Britain. And his reign was from 5 to 41 AD. And when he died, his son Caractacus was then conquered by Emperor Claudius. So in a sense you could say Canoblin was like, you know, he was a Pendragon, and he was like a warrior king. And so King Arthur was a warrior king, and he also was a great protector of England. So anyway, this Horace Round, this medieval scholar, was connecting Arthur with Canoblin. And I thought, well, I don't go into, there's a big bookshop, it's not particularly interesting, it's just got the latest books. And it has a very small section on say, the alternative, you know, magic and UFOs and things like that. But I pop in there I used to pop in there once in a while, just to kind of keep up on what the books were and so forth and so on, just very few books. But I did notice the Bloodline of the Holy Grail by Lawrence Gardner. And I was just looking at that, and I was looking in the index, and I noticed Colchester. It's actually referenced this town. I was very, very surprised, you know, mentioned Colchester. And he actually mentioned this medieval scholar Horace Round, and he actually mentions the fact that Camulod and Camelot is related. So he did identify it as the Grail Castle, which I'd already done. I'd already done that. And of course, Lawrence Gardner, his book, Bloodline of the Holy Grail, obviously is a reference to the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which came out in about 1982. Very influential, very impressive book. I mean, it really, not that I was necessarily directly inspired by that, but certainly it's the sort of thing that I write about. And so that gave validation to the idea that this was actually the Grail Castle. It's very impressive. And so I'd known the old man for about a year, and it was the Christmas of 2000, just coming on to 2001. And I was reading a journal on Jungian studies, and it was about the individuation process, which is kind of, you might say, the process of self-knowledge in Jungian terms, the individuation process. And I was reading this journal, and it was about this American lady who was being analysed by Jung. And she was an artist, and she came over from America to Zurich, where Jung was, and she the night before, I think it was the night before, a few days before she was going to be analysed by Jung, she did a picture, and she did a picture of the sea and these rocks, and some of the rock, one of the rocks was like a pyramid, and another was like an egg. And then she meets Jung, and then she dreams something and makes a painting of it, and it shows a flash of lightning coming down and cracking open one of the pyramid, one of the rocks that's shaped like a pyramid. And I think she references Jung in the dream. So Jung becomes the kind of wizard that cracks open this pyramid, as it were, and releases this energy, and then she starts having these very unusual things happen in her life, and as she's being analysed, things work out for her, and I think she becomes an analyst and whatever. But as I was looking at these pictures, I felt very dizzy. I started to feel very, very dizzy, vertigo, really dizzy. And I've had this problem since I was a child. You know, if I would get a bit dizzy, a bit nauseous, but it wasn't a problem. But it was always there in my childhood, all the way through my life. And I got this dizziness, and usually I might get it and it just go away, more or less go away within minutes, within a few hours. But this didn't go away. Day after day after day, I had constant vertigo. And I went to the doctors. She didn't seem to know what it was. I had my eyes were examined, my ears were examined by specialists. I went to an acupuncture, and I actually went to London to Jungian therapy, thinking that if I got into dreams and into Jungian therapy, I might be able to uncover what's going on in my psyche, what may be to do with childhood, whatever, what was going on. So I used to commute by train to London, and the analyst from the psychoanalytic and the Analytical Psychology Society was my friend at the university. One of his colleagues is quite well known. He's been on the radio and he consults with the government. He found an analyst for me, a lady, Julia Patton, and I used to go to Highgate. And when I first went to Highgate, I met her at the front door. She had these incredible green eyes, these beautiful, absolutely beautiful green eyes. Anyway, we go upstairs into this room. We're on the top floor, and there's just this small window, so it's quite dark in there. She sat with her back to the window, and I was facing her, and I could just look through the window. And as I looked through the window, all I could see in the middle of the window at a distance was a spire, this kind of grey, silvery grey spire, just the top of a spire. And this was in 2000. And in the early 70s, when I was going around to different squats, I squatted in Oxford, Wales, in London, and went to different communes all over for a number of years. One of the squats was in Archway, and Archway is near Highgate and near Hampstead Heath, and it's right next to Highgate Cemetery, where in fact I used to hang out in Highgate Cemetery a lot and just sit around in there. It was all very quiet and very, very natural, lots of trees and everything, and quite close to Karl Marx's grave. And that's where Hammer Horrors used to make their films in the 60s and 70s, because they had these huge mausoleums, and you can walk down inside the ground in these mausoleums. So they used to do these Hammer horror films. Anyway, the house I was staying in, one of the people was into Sufism, and another one was a girl that I knew from my squatting in Wales. And what's interesting, when we lived in Wales, we lived near Lake Bala. But first of all, before we moved into the house in Lake Bala, I was with a friend, and we'd come up from Banbury near Oxford. We drove up in this van, and we were looking for a place to stay. And we went right up to Snowdonia. Of course, Snowdon is the birthplace of Parsifal. And so I'm sitting in the room, looking out of the window, and there's this spire. Well, in the house, we used to go onto the roof, and one day I was on the roof, and I thought, oh, I'll draw that spire. So I'd made a drawing mainly of the spire, this silver spire, and that was the same spire that I was looking at from the window. It was just that one spire in the window, as it were. So I had this vertigo. It affected my eyes, it affected my coordination, and I used to go into the kitchen. You know, when you're in the kitchen, you're opening cupboards, moving around, turning around a lot, and I almost used to fall over. I was like spinning out of control and that kind of thing. So it's pretty, you know. Now, at that time, I was living in this other place with my friend at the university. He decides to get married. So he decides to get married, and to one of his pupils who was doing a PhD in Jungian studies, and she was from Japan. Anyway, so I was feeling very ill, and the doctor didn't know what it was, and nothing worked in the Jungian therapy, acupuncture, all these specialists, nothing worked. And I was feeling quite ill, and he was going to move out, so I had to move out. So I went to the local council, and I explained that I was feeling quite ill. I didn't feel capable of looking for a place to live, you know. And they gave me a place. They immediately gave me a place, a really nice flat where I'm living now, really nice flat. And of course it's right next to the castle. And it was only years later where I was at the doctor's, and I was having something done by one of the nurses, and we just started talking about this vertigo thing that I had. She said, oh, it sounds like a stroke. Sounds like you've had a stroke. And of course, there are all the symptoms of having a stroke. So it must have been a minor stroke, which was actually precipitated or caused by looking at this individuation process, these pictures to do with Jung. So anyway, I move in here in the autumn of 2001, and I start going to the spiritualist church. I go there for healing. I went there for healing, and I got very friendly with one of the committee members, this woman, and her husband, very, very involved in, she was a medium, and I used to go to a closed circle at her house and everything, and different things. And it's almost like something in my psyche right now is preventing me from remembering. It's quite interesting because the most important thing in that illness, that stroke, which took 7 years to clear up. I mean, it really took 7 years to clear up. What was interesting about that episode was that 2 years later, I move in here and I have no furniture, and this lady at the Spiritist Church helps me, takes me in her car, etc. And we get a table. I got this big big old table, round table. I got a bed, and she gave me a chair, and it was her healing chair. So she had this chair remodeled. It's really an old chair, the one I'm sitting in right now, actually. And this was the cover she put there. It's a bit faded now. It used to be a darker pink, and it's got fish all over it. So the pattern on this chair are fishes, and I think she was quite into Pisces and Christianity. And this was a healing chair. And so there was absolutely nothing in here, absolutely nothing in here. And I started to, I just used to sit here in the evening with a candle, look out of the castle. It was illuminated, and really for a long time, months and years, I did nothing. I couldn't do anything. So I had pictures in frames. I had some pictures in frames. They were against the wall on the floor. I just didn't have the energy or the inspiration to hang them on the wall. I had no furniture, I had nothing. My friend was busy with his wife. I was used to being with him every day. Now he was with his wife, etc. And the old man had given me a print, a beautiful old print he had. A really big print of the Mona Lisa, and I put it in this frame. I had this golden frame, and it was just to my right, and I'd just look at that. So the light would be flickering, and it would just be shining onto this. So it's almost like an illuminated, you could think of the Madonna or something in the church. It was just like a shrine or something, just illuminated. So my eyes would keep on going to that figure and looking at the figure, and she's there in the green robe, and there's some mountains, and there's a stream coming down the side where she's sitting and everything, by Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa. In fact, in 1966, when I was married in America, I took a break from university, came back to England and had a grand tour of Europe, and actually saw the Mona Lisa in the Louvre in Paris. But anyway, I kept on looking at this figure, and my mind was thinking, well, what does it mean? What's going on there? Who is she? And I'd not read anything. I didn't know anything about Mona Lisa, really. So I was just looking and just wondering and I didn't know anything about, I'd read I don't think I'd even read the Holy Blood, Holy Grail yet. No, I don't think I'd read it yet. I'm not sure. Don't think I had. And they go into the, Leonardo da Vinci, Mona Lisa, or the Magdalene, and so forth and so on. So I kept on looking at this picture, and it's the only thing I was looking at. I had a bit of music on. I've never had a television or anything, just had a bit of music on. And I thought, what's going on there? And then the feeling came that she was pregnant, right? Just the sense that she was pregnant. That's the only thing that stayed with me, she was pregnant. Well, my friend would come over and visit me, and he came over just after I thought that. And he said that on Sunday, this coming Sunday, on the BBC 2, a doctor is going to give a programme on the Mona Lisa this Sunday. So anyway, it passed, and he came again, and he told me that what happened was, at the end of the program, the conclusion was that she was pregnant. And the giveaway sign for him, the doctor, was that her fingers were swollen. So he diagnosed the fact that she was pregnant through the fact that her fingers were slightly swollen. And of course that was what I thought, that she was pregnant. So anyway, I gradually got things together, collecting books, and I got some lovely glass bookcases and a really good collection of books, etc. And during my childhood, I never read books. And I started reading my first book at the age of 18, when I lived in Poughkeepsie, New York, with somebody that was an inventor for IBM. And then in the summer after the high school, I worked for IBM on the Apollo rocket, working on modules and things for the Apollo rocket, just basic work, before I went to university. And I did very well in university, but it was more conversation. So in comparative religion and philosophy, it was more conversation between myself and the teacher, a bit like the tutorials would be in Oxford. And I did very well in conversation. But in terms of memory, like my friends got very high IQ. In Oxford, I mean, the basic thing is that people that are academic, you might say, and are even professional, the professional class, they rely on a certain kind of tabulation of memory. They can list things, they can remember things, in a chain of events, and they can tabulate things and everything. The very thing I can't do. I'm very intuitive, I'm very lateral thinking, I'm not linear thinking. So my memory was hopeless. So the only way I got through American literature and various subjects in college, and art history, was to what they call cramming. For a week before the exam, I would just cram, and I was able to remember enough to get fairly good marks. So I was on the honours list, etc. But when I started to do the research and review the whole of my life and amplify the symbols and everything, over time, my memory became extraordinary. I mean, even now, when I'm giving these talks now, I mean, I'm not using any notes or anything, and I haven't thought about these things in a long time. But the point is that my memory became very, very good. And so I could just read something or hear something and remember it, whereas before I couldn't remember anything. Now, the interesting thing is, I believe that this area in the brain that was affected by the stroke, I'm calling it a stroke, but it's actually on a deeper level, what Jung would call the unconscious, the archetypal unconscious or collective unconscious. If you constellate the collective unconscious archetypally, then that will bring about a shock in the psychophysical body-mind. That can bring about a shock. And I believe that was a shock from reading Jung, and that was part of my destiny, to be for my brain to be shocked. And I believe it affected my memory. I believe that it actually caused my memory to be activated, as it were, at some kind of IQ level, as it were. before I moved here, and before that shock came about, that traumatic shock, the vertigo, looking at Jung, the journal, I think it was Harvest. I think the magazine was actually Harvest. It was produced in England, and my friend was an editor, and his colleague actually ran the magazine. Well, I was sitting in the chair by the window, and just outside the window, that's where the UFO took place earlier. And there's a row of rosemary, blue-flowered rosemary bushes, the herb rosemary. And I was sitting there, and suddenly there was a wooden fence. It wasn't a fence; it was just this a wooden fence, say, just by the rosemary. And suddenly I just caught something out of to my right, and this blackbird came flying towards the window. I mean, real speed, and it just stopped on this fence, and I could see its body swaying. And it looked right at me. It looked right through the window. It was looking right at me. Now, another time, I was listening to the composer Chopin, his piano music, which is very beautiful music and very profound, very deep and very romantic, but also very mysterious. If you listen to it, it's a very mysterious type of music. And I could see in the distance this bush swaying in the wind, as it happened in the old man's house later on. But I saw this bush swaying, and it was swaying to the music. So as I looked at this bush, it was swaying to the music, and all these, like, you might say, figures or you know, kind of magical figures appeared in the bush. So as it was swaying, all these like beings and entities were like swaying in this bush. It was very peculiar. Another thing that happened around that time, I don't know how they're connected, but another thing that happened around that time, sitting in the same chair by the window, I felt that something, somebody, some being opened up the top of my head, literally as if you can imagine a psychic healer putting his hands into the body. Well, this was like on the astral level. Imagine somebody opening up the top of my head, literally pulling the two hemispheres apart. And right through my body, it was like an abyss. It's like this abyss, this shaft opened up right through my body. And I wasn't afraid. It was like a shock. It was very shocking. But I wasn't afraid, and I just sat there, and I just like felt this abyss, this opening, and it was just like my brain was like clay, like soft clay, and it opened up at the top. And I believe that had to do with my brain and this thing that happened later with Jung, and then affecting my memory, etc., 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 and making that connection in London to my past and seeing the spire, you know, and just so many things. It's hard to actually analyse it all, but I do believe that actually had to do with doing something to my brain. It was like, you know, because there is an alien contact in my life, I have direct alien contact, then I believe it was like an alien, as it were, intelligence working on me and bringing all these things about. So life is always, for me, what's called the numinous. The numinous emanates from what Rudolf Otto, who coined the term numinous, it emanates from the holy other. That's why I called my latest book on conspiracy theory and UFOs, Alien Other. The holy other, he says that when the holy other, the divine presence, touches you, comes into your life, touches you. It can be through nature, it can be through music, it can be through visions, the intuitive level, etc. And the archetypal emanation, as it were. When that touches you, it fills you with fascination. So you get fascinated with the occult, fascinated with the mysterious, fascinated with other people, fascinated with your own life. It's fascination, there's awe, it's awesome, it's just so big, it's so powerful, it's so overwhelming, and yet the most interesting part of it is it's terrible. There's an element of terror, trauma, shock, terror. Imagine being born into this life as a baby, the shock. And I would underline, if somebody came to this planet and said, what's it like here? And I would say, it's terrible. You know, life for me is terrible. But I don't mean, you know, I don't mean that life, I mean people that suffer torture and children that are abused, all these kind of things, of course, they're not really in the category I'm talking about. That, I mean, that's part of it. That's actually part of it. But the terrible is one of the threads that's woven into the tapestry of your life story. And the terrible is fascinating and it's awesome. And it's called the Mysterium Tremendum. So the Mysterium Tremendum is that it is fascinating, it's awesome, and it's terrible. So, and of course, the history of consensus reality, one might say, the establishment, consensus reality, academia, the conditioning process of society, of course, the hidden, the occult, is always warned against. I mean, even the occultists themselves, you know, warn against it. But for me, it's never been like that. I'm not afraid. I mean, I experience all the instincts of fear and all of that. But I know in myself, not in my ego, but in myself, and I've always had an awareness of myself all my life. And I've had experiences as a divine child at the age of 2. So I know that the self is spiritual. I know the self is not of this world. So life, whatever it throws at me, I can take it. And it doesn't really matter. I could die now. It wouldn't really matter to me personally. But no, I would say that my whole life has been about risk. And I would say every day I have moments of enlightenment. Every day I see things. Every day there are minor awakenings. And the fabric of Maya, the veil of illusion, you know, that because I have the third eye, and that's my bloodstone anyway, third eye, that I can't not see things. And I've never really, I mean, on a personal daily level, I used to share that with my friend, but I've been alone now for 17 years and I don't really share it with anybody. It's quite lonely in a way, but I don't share it. But because I have this spiritual component in my life, I'm very independent, I'm very autonomous, and I can go it alone if I have to. But as I say, I don't have to look for anything because it's right around me. I mean, you know, it's like in the house here, you know, hundreds of apparitions from every conceivable aspect of mythology and astral and whatever. And, you know, to me, I would say, in fact, I turned my nephew onto the occult when he was quite young. And he studied artificial intelligence at Sussex University, and he did his final dissertation, his final programming, as it were, on the tarot. And I would say the occult is really my favourite subject, and I would encourage anybody to get involved with the occult. I mean, to me, the occult, without opening the book of the knowledge of good and evil, that you could put on the front, the emblem on the front would be the B666, because the Bible in Genesis opens with a serpent, and in Revelation it ends with the serpent being cast into the pit, the scarlet dragon. Just as we have to overcome occultism itself in the form of Aleister Crowley, and he signifies to me, he's a brave person, he's a mountain climber, he's a great experimenter, and yes, there are some very negative things said about him, but I think as a phenomenon, as a figure in history, and in mythology, he's definitely the B666, and to master occultism and go beyond occultism, that's the whole, go beyond the meta-programming of the gods and enter the one. I mean, to me, there's only one real refuge, and that's the one. So this is the third part. It's the end. So I wish you well.